My name is Bruno Bianchi Sarcone. This is the Spanish Taxes Overview 2025 free webinar of Spainguru. And I run Spainguru.es. Our objective is facilitating the relocation process for English-speaking foreigners to Spain since 2014. And we have wonderful reviews on Trustpilot and on Google. So you're in good hands. You can use Spainguru for absolutely free. You can join our weekly newsletter, watch our YouTube channel, read our almost 2,000 articles on our blog post, and join our Facebook groups community with an aggregated total of 150,000 members. You can find on Spainguru.es 6 free webinars, the newsletter, and a recently released Move to Spain checklist, where we start 1 year before your intended move to Spain date, and we detail every single step that you need to do in order to move to Spain, together with information, resources, vetted partners that can help you along the way. Plus, last week I released Spainguru's destinations with 13 places in Spain that I think covers 90% of areas where expats and foreigners move in Spain. So you're covered there as well. If you need expert vetted, personally vetted services, and I minimum recommend you to engage with immigration experts and tax experts. That's the bare minimum. At least consult for an hour just to make sure that your ideas are okay. They're let's say they're practical and can happen. Make sure to engage with tax advisors and immigration experts. You can, of course, find them on Spainguru.es, but there's also financial planners. If you're planning to apply for visas, you can find compliant health insurances, medical certificates, sworn translations, apostille services, and many more services like bank accounts, money transfer services, property rentals, mortgages, if you plan to rent to a purchase property in Spain. All those you can find them on Spainguru.es. I have worked for several years with all my partners. I have personally vetted myself, so you're in very good hands. Now, about this webinar, remember that this presentation is for general information only and is not legal advice or financial or tax advice. For personal guidance, I highly recommend you consulting with a qualified advisor because your personal situation and where you decide to move in Spain can have a very strong influence on your tax liability, okay? And of course, you can find trusted experts on Spainguru.es, as I just mentioned. The objectives of these webinars are several. First, gaining an overview of Spanish taxes and understanding the key tax categories in Spain or different regimes. Learn the basic principles behind the taxation in Spain. Be prepared to have more sophisticated or more informed conversations with tax advisors who sometimes it feels that they speak a different language. You know, they speak with the jargon, they speak with their industry terms. But if you watch this webinar, hopefully you will have more information to engage more effectively with them and clarify the role of those tax advisors, because this webinar will only provide general information and will never replace personalized advice, and also identifying key considerations like potential tax implications and liabilities with a focus on US and UK nationals. But I would say 95% of this webinar also is applicable for any other foreigner moving to Spain. And hopefully you will be aware of compliance requirements and deadlines to avoid potential penalties or issues. So all that I hope you take from this webinar. Now let's start with the most important consideration, in my opinion, which is Spanish tax residency. When do you become a tax resident in Spain? And what happens when you become one? The most important thing is you will start paying taxes on your global income to Spanish tax authorities, and potentially you would be liable for paying tax on the net value of your assets via the different wealth taxes, okay? When do you become a Spanish tax resident? If any of these 3 conditions happen. The most important one is if you spend more than 183 days in Spain within a calendar year from January 1st to December 31st. That is the tax year. It's a calendar year, different from the immigration year, which is a natural year. Immigration year, for example, if you move on the 1st of June in 2025, your immigration year will go to June 2026, whereas the tax year always starts on January 1st to December 31st. Now, those 193 days in a tax year don't need to be consecutive. So every presence in Spain will count, regardless of your immigration status. Doesn't matter if you're a tourist, if you are a visa holder, or anything else. All days will count, and 1 minute of your feet on Spanish soil count as a day spent in Spain. Then the second condition, and I was saying that if you travel to Spain on a scouting trip at the beginning of the year, those days will count as a tourist. And then after you get a visa and you enter Spain with a visa, holding a visa, all those days will count. Okay, so it's important. And sometimes when you move from one country to another, there could be conflicts in the rules that, maybe both countries consider you to be a tax resident during that same calendar year. So it's important to refer to double taxation treaties. Spain has double taxation treaties with USA, UK, Canada, Australia, and many more countries, with tiebreaker rules that will determine where you are a Spanish tax resident or not, okay, for that specific year, right? So as I said, it's important to understand whether you become a Spanish tax resident or not, because the tax liabilities will be different whether you're a resident or a non-resident. If you're a non-resident, it will depend whether you're a non-EU passport holder or a EU passport holder or EEA associated countries, like Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and so on, because the effective tax rates for income sourced from Spain, as a non-resident, you will only pay taxes on your income sourced from Spain. For example, you own a property and you rent it out in Spain, well, you will have to pay non-resident tax. For example, it would be 19% if you're an EU passport holder, but if you're a non-EU passport holder, that tax rate goes up to 24%. And there you have the table. Now, the tax systems and obligations in Spain. There are different tax systems or regimes. There's a general tax regime and there is a special tax regime, also known as Beckham law. Within the general tax regime, you will have personal income tax, regional wealth tax, solidarity tax on a nation level, okay, and informative form 720 for declaring the overseas assets. Within the special tax regime, it is a different tax that not everybody would be eligible. You have to fulfill certain conditions for it, and mostly will be employees working for non-Spanish companies and not contractors, for example, right? First of all, you need to be working. Second of all, you should not be a contractor or a freelancer, right? You should be an employee. And there are several conditions that you need to fulfill, but that's the most important eligibility threshold, right? The advantages of this special tax regime is that you would pay a flat 24% tax rate for your income sourced from Spain, and then you can avoid, for example, paying income tax on your worldwide income or wealth tax, and you don't have to declare your overseas assets value in the 720 form, and several other perks, okay, from this special tax regime. However, there are some cons for this special regime, and tax advisors will tell you that if you don't make at least 55K to 65K in euros per year taxable income, it is not advantageous for you to apply for this special tax regime. You would be better off under the general tax regime, probably paying less tax, because there are additional also administrative burdens that may outweigh the benefits. You won't get access to family deductions or allowances. So it's always, again, important to check with someone who knows about the Beckham law before applying for it, because it needs to calculate exactly what the outcome will be for you, especially if you're close to this income threshold. Now let's talk about the first tax obligation, starting with the 720 form. This is a declaration of your assets, of the net value of your assets and rights held abroad outside of Spain, right? And it is divided by categories. For example, bank accounts, investments, real estate properties, cryptocurrencies, right? So if the sum of the assets under one category, for example, bank accounts. If you have 2 bank accounts outside of Spain with each 25,000 euros, that would be over the threshold of 50,000 euros per category. So you need to declare both bank accounts, even if none of them has more than 50,000 euros. The full category adds 50,000 euros. Therefore, you need to declare it, right? And there is a first year requirement in which you do a full disclosure of your overseas assets. And tax authorities will want to see this for potential implications for the regional wealth tax or national solidarity tax, and potentially personal income tax. For example, if they see that you have properties, maybe they can suspect that you are renting out those properties and you potentially are not declaring that income via the rental of those properties outside of Spain. Now, after the first year in which you become a Spanish tax resident, you need to declare the 720 form if you're over that threshold. The subsequent years, you don't need to declare the 720 form every year unless there are 20,000 euros variations in the value of your assets or if there are assets closures. Now, the deadline for submitting this 720 form is March 31st, okay? Now, the second tax obligation is the income tax, okay, that you do on an annual basis, and the deadline is June 30th. For example, in June 30th, 2026, you will pay taxes on your global income during all 2025. Now, there are different types of taxations depending on the type of income. There is ordinary income and investment income. Ordinary income is subject to progressive tax rates that range from 19% to 47%. Within the ordinary income, you have salaries, rental income, and business earnings, right? We're going to see how the progressive tax rates are calculated. Then you have investment income. Within investment income, you have dividends, interest, capital gains tax, and it's taxed at lower rates. Again, progressive tax brackets that go from 19% but up to 30%, okay? Now, if you are an autónomo, not only, and what is autónomo? Sorry. Autónomo is a contractor, okay? If you're a contractor, for example, I am autónomo. So I am, let's say, a single person company or figure. I have to pay my taxes. I have to pay my social security. So if you become an autónomo in Spain, contractor or freelancer, yes, you not only will have to pay your annual tax filings, but also you will have to do your quarterly taxes filings, where you pay your income tax on a quarterly basis. You pay a base of 20% income tax, and then in your annual payment, you will pay the difference. So if you pay too much, you will receive money back, or if you pay too little, you will have to pay the difference, right? And you will also have to file and eventually pay VAT that you collect from your customers, right, on a quarterly basis. That is the difference with the autonomous. Now, talking about US citizens, if you're a US passport holder, you need to file taxes regardless on where you live in the world in the US, okay? So the deadline for filing your income taxes in the US is April 15th. And the way it normally works, and since there is a double taxation agreement between the US and Spain, is that you don't pay taxes twice on the same thing. Therefore, if whatever you have paid for income taxes to the Spanish authorities, you can credit that amount for the US authorities. The way it works usually, although there are some discussions about this, is that you file an extension to pay your taxes, which is an automatic extension if the tax authorities know that you live overseas. And that extension goes from April 15th until June 15th. Therefore, the first or next deadline would be June 15th. If that's not enough, you can also extend it till October, okay? You will pay a little amount on interest, but you can do that, okay? You can do those extensions. But normally, you would file your taxes before June 15th in Spain, take that payment, and then you file your taxes in the US and you credit the payment that you did to Spain, and therefore usually the Spanish taxes are a bit higher than the American ones. Therefore, you will just file but not really pay any taxes in the US. That's the way it normally works, okay? Now, $1 million question. Is it true that I will pay 45% tax for 100K income? And this is a way to see how the tax progressive brackets work. As you can see on the right, there's a table with the different brackets. There's 6 brackets that go from 19% to 47%. So imagine that you are making taxable income of 100,000 euros per year. That would fall into the 5th bracket that goes from 60,000 euros to 300,000 euros, paying 45% tax. But the fact is that you would not pay an effective tax rate of 45%, because the way it works is that for the first 12,450 euros that you make, you would be paying 19%. For the next 7,500 euros that you make, you would be paying 24%, right? Until you reach 100,000 euros income. Therefore, you would be paying some sort of an average or median of those brackets. If you do the calculation there on the left, you can see the calculations, and you would be paying an effective tax rate on that 100K taxable income of 36%, okay, which is not especially low, but it's not 45%. So don't be so scared about it. And here's a rough calculation for illustrative purposes only of the effective tax rates depending on the amount of income or taxable income. For example, for 30,000 euros, you will be paying 24%, 40K, 26%, for 50K, 29%, for 60K, 30%, for 70K, 32%, and for 100K, 36%, okay? This is the effective tax rate for income tax. Of course, there are other taxes. If you're working in Spain, you would be paying Social Security, etc., etc. But this is just so that you understand how progressive tax brackets work in Spain, because there's many other taxes that also use progressive tax brackets, like the third tax obligation, the regional wealth tax, and the solidarity tax. That is a nationwide wealth tax. The regional wealth tax is based on the net wealth as of December 31st, okay? And you don't pay wealth tax unless you reach a certain threshold of wealth value, right? And depending on where you live in Spain, the threshold is different. For example, in Catalonia, it's quite low. It's 500,000 euros net wealth. Whereas in Madrid and in Andalusia, you could say that there is no wealth tax because the thresholds are very high, or there is a full 100% rebate on that tax. Now, in some cases, okay, there is something called the 60% rule. This is especially applicable for people who have big wealth but very little income, okay? It is a quite complex rule to understand and to explain, but it's something that I want you to have in mind if you're in this situation. You don't have too much income, but you have very big wealth, okay? Therefore, you can use this rule to limit the wealth tax liability to 60% of your taxable income. Therefore, you can reduce your wealth tax liability up to 80%, okay? So have that in mind. The deadline to file the regional wealth tax is June 30th. And whatever you paid as a wealth tax, you can credit it to the payment of the nationwide solidarity tax, okay? It is a temporary tax that will probably never go away. That it doesn't matter where you live, it will apply to you. But the threshold is much higher, starts at 3 million euros without allowances and deductions, okay? So, yeah, definitely choosing the right place where to live, if you could be over these thresholds, could make sense, okay? And the good news is that the Valencian community, which is probably right now the most popular place where people are moving, okay, in Valencia province or Alicante province, they raised the threshold to 1 million euros, okay? But this will start to apply on December 31st, 2025, okay? So very good news. Now, let's look at a calculation of a wealth tax for someone who is living in Catalonia. As we said before, this is one of the least favorable communities in Spain for this type of wealth tax. Now, there are some allowance, okay, and deductions. For example, if you own a property in Spain and that property value is 300,000 euros, you can deduct up to 300,000 euros from your taxable income, okay, for the wealth tax. And you can, of course, apply the threshold that each region has. For example, in Catalonia, the threshold is 500,000. If you own a property of at least 300,000, you can deduct 500,000 and 300,000. Therefore, if your total assets is 1 million, you can deduct 800,000 euros. Therefore, your taxable income becomes only 200,000 euros. You apply the progressive tax rate, you would be paying less than 500 euros wealth tax for that year. If your wealth is 1.5 million, you will be paying 3K. If your wealth is 2 million, you will be paying 8K. If your wealth is 2.5 million, you will be paying 13,800 euros plus, okay, for the wealth tax. And over the 3 million euros, maybe there is some liability of the solidarity tax, nationwide solidarity tax, but remember that what you have paid for wealth tax can be credited towards that tax as well. Now, let's talk about the digital nomads. What about the taxes for digital nomads? As you know, this is a pretty new visa scheme for people who work remotely for non-Spanish companies. And there are two ways to move to Spain under this visa. One is being an employee of a non-Spanish company, and the other one is to be a contractor for no Spanish company. Employees have a very interesting advantages, okay, because potentially, and as we mentioned before, they could be eligible for the special tax regime called the Beckham law. Now, if you're moving in as an employee, the company that is hiring you, they have two options. One, either this company pays Social Security in the origin country, but has to submit a certificate of coverage of the Social Security, also known as A1, okay, that is accepted by Spanish authorities. And right now, Spanish authorities only accept the ones in the UK and in the US for W2 employees, okay? Or if they cannot supply this certificate of coverage, this company needs to open a company in Spain and pay Social Security for you in Spain as an employee, right? As sometimes this is not viable, some people decide to convert themselves into contractors, and then they will become autonomous once they move in Spain, and they will have to pay themselves their Social Security in Spain and pay their taxes in Spain, okay? As I said, if you move as an employee, there is the interesting benefit that potentially you could be eligible for Beckham law, which is very interesting if you're making more than 60,000 euros, okay? So this is one thing to have in mind. Now, if you're moving as a contractor, remember that you will pay your Social Security, you will pay your pension, you will pay your taxes on a quarterly basis and annual basis. The good thing is that the Social Security will give you access to public healthcare system, okay, and also pension benefits, okay, or if you get sick, benefits, etc., right? Now, the fact that it gives you public healthcare system access enables you not to have a private health insurance when you apply for the digital nomad visa, okay? Just for the sake of applying for the digital nomad visa. But be careful, because it's highly recommended to have a private health insurance when you apply for this visa, because there shouldn't be any coverage gaps once you apply for the long-term visa later on. So this is also something to have in mind, okay? Now, remember that as a contractor, it is very unlikely that you are eligible for the Beckham law, okay? And you will have to pay and file taxes on a quarterly and annual basis, okay? Now, this is a case scenario of someone who moves later in the year after July 2nd, spending less than 183 days in Spain, that specific year, therefore not becoming a tax resident in Spain. This person arrives in Spain in September 2024, applies for the digital nomad visa in October, receives it in November, and registers as autónomo in December. Now, this is an expert who answers the question of this particular person who asked, like, how much taxes and where do I have to pay? Am I a resident, non-resident? So this expert says this is a particularly gray area, as you weren't a resident until you got your residency card, so you weren't officially allowed to work. But of course, this person is a digital nomad working on the computer from Spain for a non-Spanish company. And in this case, you are supposed to pay tax in the country where you're physically working, which is which is Spain in this case. So strictly speaking, any work that you're doing from Spain, even if you're non-resident, you need to pay taxes as a non-resident. So if you ask a tax advisor generally that is experienced in the digital nomad visa and in these situations, will say that this person has to pay taxes as a non-resident in 2024, and then in 2025, this person will become a tax resident in Spain and start paying taxes as an autonomo always, but as a resident in Spain. Okay, if you want to know more about this type of visa, you can join my free webinar that I have every 2 to 3 weeks, and also I record every single time. Now there's a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. Remember that you can ask your questions anytime in the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen. Just add a question mark at the end of your question. And if you think that the information that I'm sharing with you today, if you're learning something new, please leave a review on Trustpilot. I would really appreciate it if you do it. There's a red bar there with a green bar there on the top with a red button that redirects you to Trustpilot, where you can leave your review. It only takes a few seconds, and it really makes my day and helps me out a lot. Now let's talk about additional taxes in Spain. Okay, and this is a general list. Okay, there is the inheritance and gift tax. Okay, that it is paid by the heir or recipient, and it is a regional tax. So the reductions and exemptions will vary strongly by region. For example, they say that it is very expensive to die in Catalonia and very cheap to die in Madrid. In general, Madrid and Andalusia are the best regions in Spain in terms of regional taxes, of regional taxation. Okay. Then there is a transfer tax. This is a tax that applies if you buy a second-hand property, so no new build. So new build properties pay a nationwide reduced VAT of 10%, whereas second-hand properties, you will have to pay a transfer tax that is a regional tax, depends on the region. Again, Madrid is the lowest one with 6% only, Andalusia 7%, and it goes up. In Catalonia is around 10-11%. The same happens to Valencia. Okay, and this type of tax, when you purchase a property, you have 60 days to pay it. Okay, so you have to take it into account and budget it, because it is a sizable amount of money. For example, if you buy a 300,000 euros property in Andalusia, in 60 days maximum, you will have to pay cash 21,000 euros of transfer tax. This is different than in the US, where similar taxes, you pay them when you sell the property many years later after purchase. But here you have to pay that tax when you buy it. Now, recently, Mr. Pedro Sánchez, Prime Minister of Spain, announced in a political meeting an increase of this tax for non-EU passport holders who are non-tax residents in Spain. Okay, non-tax resident in Spain. And the increase would be tremendous. It would be that you have to pay transfer tax for 100% of the value of the property, right? So if you're a non-EU, non-resident in Spain, and you want to buy a 300,000 euro property, which is common price for a property in Spain, you would have to pay 300,000 euros of transfer tax. I'm going to talk about this in the next slide, okay? But I'll leave it to you there. Then there is the property tax, okay, that you pay on an annual basis if you're owner of a property, which usually tends to be quite affordable for what Americans say. Normally, the calculation that I have in my head is that you pay, the amount that you pay in 1 year in Spain is what you pay in the US for a similar property per month, okay? And then you have the municipal capital gains tax, okay, and the capital gains tax. No, so you have two different taxes there that I have made a little comparison here. I think here it is. So if you sell your property, if you sell a property, you will be paying capital gains tax, okay, when you do your let's say your annual income tax, okay, so on the income that you made. But if you sell a property in Spain, you will also be paying the plusvalía municipal, which is a local town hall tax that depends on the cadastral value of the property that you have sold and the increasing value of your property. Okay, so this is the difference between those two taxes. Now, coming back to the 100% of the property price transfer tax, I have interviewed Ainhoa Maneiro, expert immigration lawyer, that I highly recommend, and Marcos Gonzalez, who is a expert tax lawyer. You can watch that interview, but long story short, basically they see it very unlikely to happen. Now they went to the next stage in which they are discussing how to apply this tax, if it's possible to do it. And but basically what tax experts say that it is very, very unlikely that this tax moves forward because it goes against certain rights within the European Union that cannot be overcome by this regional tax from Spain. Therefore, they see it very, very unlikely, but nobody can say that it is impossible. Okay, so we're going to be having a close look to the evolution of this discussion. But again, remember, if you are a non-EU passport holder and you obtain a visa to live in Spain, yes, you become a resident in Spain, or you become a tax resident in Spain, and then you would buy it and you would be paying normal transfer tax. This would be only applicable for non-European passport holders who are non-residents in Spain, right? And just a little bit of investigation that I did here. It would have very, very little impact because supposedly the idea of taxing non-EU, non-residents who are trying to speculate, with the prices of properties will have a very little impact in the prices of properties because it is only 2.7% of the transactions in Spain who are done by this type of buyer. Okay, so imagine the little impact that can have this, and of course it could become 0% if you apply this tax. Okay, so yeah, this is the it sounds like a very political thing and not something really thought with data in mind. Now let's talk about capital gains tax. How can I avoid the Spanish capital gain tax? This is also a very commonly asked question. First of all, there are mitigation ways. There are ways to mitigate this tax. If you're older than 65 years of age and you sell your primary property and you buy a property in Spain with the full proceeds, etc., there are ways to not pay the capital gains tax under certain circumstances. But the best way to do it, especially if you're planning to move to Spain and you have to sell your home before, is that you sell your home in a different tax year and you move to Spain in a different tax year. So you don't become a Spanish tax resident during the same calendar year in which you sold your home. Easy example, the one on the top, you sell your property in December and you move to Spain in January. These are different tax years. Okay. Now, the second one is a little bit trickier. You sell your home, for example, in January of a certain year. Imagine you sell your home in January 2025. You get your Spanish visa in April, and then you move to Spain later, right? So you have to be careful not to spend 183 days during that same calendar year. Therefore, if you haven't been a single minute in Spain until July 2nd, you move on July 2nd, there's only 182 days left during that year, okay? If you move a little bit less, before July 2nd, make sure to leave Spain, during the same amount of days that you arrived earlier, okay? So don't become a Spanish tax resident during that same calendar year because it works in a way retroactively, okay? You can become a Spanish tax resident, let's say, later in the year, but it will cover any taxable event from January 1st. Okay, that's very important, right? So yeah, this capital gains tax is taxed with progressive tax brackets that range from 19% to 30%, and the way to calculate it is the same as the one I explained you with the income tax, except that the brackets have lower rates, okay? Now, let's talk about a capital gains tax case scenario, right? Imagine that you have purchased a property for 100,000 euros and you sold it for 200,000 euros. Therefore, you made 1,000 euros difference. That is the capital gain. And that's the taxable income. The taxable income of 100,000 euros. For the first 6,000 euros, you will pay 19%, for the next 44,000 euros, 21%, and for the remainder 50,000 euros, you would pay 23%. Therefore, the effective tax rate would be around 22%. Okay, there are deductions, there are things that you can take away from the taxable income, but this is for illustrative purposes only. Would be more or less how you do the calculation. Okay. Another question is, if you retire in Spain, is my pension taxable? The answer is yes and no. It depends on the type of pension and depends on the double taxation agreement between your country and Spain, right? But first, let's start with ordinary pensions. You will be taxed if you're a Spanish tax resident for your ordinary pension. If you have a single income source, the annual threshold for filing is 22,000 euros. But if you have multiple income sources, that threshold goes down to 12,000 euros of aggregate income and only 1,500 euros for secondary sources. Now, also, pensions from abroad appear as a second payer, so if they're greater than 1,500 euros per year, you have to file it anyways, right? The progressive tax rates range from 19% to 47%. This is ordinary income. Now, as we said, there are double taxation agreements between the US and UK and other countries where that social security and private pensions are taxable, but government pensions are exempt, or public sector pensions are exempt from paying taxes in Spain. Okay, so like teachers' pensions, policeman pensions, this kind of pensions. Okay, always check with the Spanish tax advisor to review what type of pension you have and whether it would be considered or not tax exempt in Spain. Now, the allowances for pensioners for ages 65 until 74 is 6,700 euros annual allowance, and over 75 it goes up to 8,100 euros. Okay, now taxation of 401ks and Roth IRAs in Spain from the US. 401ks distributions are taxed as general income and traditionally exempt from Modelo 720. But there's been some interpretations from the tax authorities lately that would suggest that also should be included in the Modelo 720. Check with your tax advisor. Roth IRAs taxation, investment gains tax as income at progressive rates, okay, but up to 30% because that is a different type of income, is an investment, must be reported on Modelo 720 annually based on the account surrender value as of December 31st. And this would also be subject to wealth tax calculations or solidarity tax, but of course, wealth tax is a regional tax with variations, okay? If you want to know more about 401ks, pensions, taxation implications, etc., you can read these articles, okay, on Spainguru.es, taxation on 401ks, Roth IRAs taxations, taxes for UK expats, taxes for Americans living in Spain. There you have your QR codes, and if you want the links, you can always send me an email to hello@spainguru.es, and I will send you the links for anything you need. Now, let's continue with another question. And now focusing more into the non-lucrative visa. Do I have to become a tax resident in order to renew my NLV, my non-lucrative visa? Most recently, the Reglamento de Extranjería or the bylaw or the application of the immigration laws changed on May 20th, 2025. Okay, and now there's a minimum stay requirement of 183 days in order to be able to renew the non-lucrative visa. Right now, do I have to become a tax resident in Spain? The answer is no. You don't have to in order to renew your visa. And I'm just repeating what Ainhoa Manero, immigration lawyer that I highly recommend working with, says about this. First of all, the tax year is a calendar year and the immigration year is a natural year. They may or not overlap, first of all. Second of all, since the minimum stay requirement to renew the non-lucrative visa was included in a bylaw or Reglamento de Extranjería and not the main organic law that is higher in hierarchy, okay, the Supreme Court ruling said that this minimum requirement cannot be enforceable, because if you want to establish a minimum stay requirement for the renewal of the temporary visas, like non-lucrative visa, you need to include it in the main law and not in the reglamento or by law. Therefore, this is not enforceable. Okay, so if immigration denies your non-lucrative visa renewal on the basis that you have stayed less than 183 days on an immigration natural year, it can be successfully challenged in court. Okay, so if you don't want to become a Spanish tax resident, be able to renew your non-lucrative visa, you highly recommend you to work with experts that you can find on Spainguru.es. If you want to watch the video directly and listen to what Ainhoa says about this directly, you can watch this video on Spainguru's YouTube channel. Now let's go to wrap up or sum up the content of this presentation. Okay, and I try to write a cheat sheet here with the main concepts that we already discussed. First, the tax residency in Spain. If you stay in Spain for more than 183 days in a calendar year, they don't need to be consecutive. An immigration status count from January 1st to December 31st, and 2 other conditions. Okay. Key tax obligations, Modelo 720, declaration of overseas assets and rights held abroad, personal income tax, annual income tax on June 30th, with progressive tax rates from 19% to 47%. If you're a contractor or autónomo, you have to also do income tax filings on a quarterly basis. Investment income is taxed at lower rates from 19 to 30%. Wealth tax is a regional tax, so depending where you move, you will have different thresholds. Madrid and Andalusia, the best ones. Catalonia and others, not so favorable. Valencia is raising the threshold at 1 million at the end of this year. Then there is the national solidarity tax that applies at a higher threshold of 3 million euros plus. Okay, and it's nationwide. Then there is the special tax regime called the Beckham law, with advantages and disadvantages. Advantages is a flat rate of 24% income tax from the income source in Spain, but not outside of Spain. You don't have to declare your wealth tax, declare 720, but eligibility is almost always for employees and not for contractors. And it makes sense if you're making more than 55 to 60K annual income. 4, taxation on pensions. Remember that Social Security and ordinary pensions are taxed in Spain, but as per the dual agreements between Spain and other countries, public sector or government pensions could be tax exempt in Spain. The taxation of U.S. investment accounts for one case is taxed as general income with progressive rates up to 47%. Roth IRA's investment gain takes up to, I think, should be 30%. There is a typo I should fix, and needs to be declared probably both of them in the 720 form. And taxes for digital nomads. You have employees and contractors. So if you're employees, you need to either prove that you're paying Social Security in your country, or if the company needs to pay Social Security in Spain, or if you become a contractor, you need to become an autónomo in Spain and pay yourself Social Security in Spain. Okay, I go much more in depth about taxes for digital nomads in my Digital Nomads webinar. Then there are additional taxes that we mentioned: inheritance and gift tax, regional tax, property tax once you own a property, capital gains tax if you sell your property, even if you're abroad and you become a Spanish tax resident. So be careful with that. Time your move to Spain. Transfer tax, depending on when you buy a second-hand property, you will pay more or less tax. And then the deadlines, we saw them. 720 form is March 31st. Personal income tax, June 30th. Annual income tax. Wealth tax, June 30th. Solidarity tax is July 31st, 1 month after the wealth tax. And if you're a contractor, you will have to do quarterly filings and payments as well. Remember that you can find on Spainguru personally vetted experts for tax advice, for financial planning services, but not also those, but also immigration experts and other expert consultants. And if you're applying for the visa, you can find compliant health insurance, medical certificates, form translations, apostle services, and many, many more services that have been personally vetted by me. Join my free 6 webinars that you can find on Spainguru, and let's stay in touch. You can always write to me on hello@spainguru.es. I always answer my emails. Join the Facebook groups. You have Digital Nomad Visa dedicated groups, non-lucrative visa dedicated groups, general immigration groups, expats, Americans in Spain, retirees in Spain, so many groups. And of course, I have the weekly newsletter and the YouTube channel. Remember that the content of this webinar is for information purposes only and is not tax nor legal advice. Please consult with experienced tax advisors.